I wanted to go through a brief thought experiment with you. Imagine that you have just exited your car and you've closed the door and you're walking away from your car and you can't quite remember if you locked your car. Let's say you're about, 50, 60 feet from the car and you think the car is still unlocked. With that thought that the car is possibly unlocked, you might have a feeling of anxiety, a feeling of dread, just for a brief instant. And because you're doubting whether or not you've performed a specific action, you feel the need to go back and to check to see if the car is locked. Or if you have one of those electronic key fobs and your car locks electronically, then you just take that out of your pocket and you press it and you listen for the beep sound. Now, how many of you have done that? And then you walk maybe about 30 feet more away from the car, and the doubt enters your head. Have I really locked the car? So you press the button again. And maybe you press it a third time, just for good measure. Or perhaps you've exited your apartment, your dorm room, and you're not sure if you've locked the door. Again, the same sort of principle. So you go back to check it. You make sure that the handle, the knob doesn't turn, that it stays locked, that you can tell that it's locked. If there's that doubt in your mind that perhaps you failed to perform some action, you feel the need to go back and check. Or let's say you're exiting a bathroom and you've washed your hands, but your hand touches the doorknob, and the doorknob is wet, and your hands were dry. And as you look down at your hands, you think, what could have been on that doorknob? Was it water from someone just having washed their hands, or was it something else? So maybe you go back to the sink and wash your hands again. I think you can probably see where I'm going with this. All of these start to sound like symptoms of obsessive-compulsive disorder. My point that I'm trying to make, perhaps not so subtly, is that all of us have tendencies of obsessive-compulsive disorder. A thought enters our head that perhaps we haven't performed some essential act that we need to perform in order to keep our belongings safe, or to keep our household safe, like locking the doors at night, making sure that the curling iron is turned off, or that the toaster or coffee pot has been turned off, or that they're unplugged so the house doesn't burn down. In my case, a winter a couple of years ago, I had it happen that I pulled away from the house and I got onto Harlem Avenue, and a doubt entered my head as to whether or not I had shut the garage door. And I realized that, that doubt was going to plague me throughout the day, so I had enough time. I circled back, went around, and checked the garage door. I needed to know. That anxiety that we feel many times, that doubt, compels us to perform a certain behavior. So when we look at obsessive-compulsive disorder, the first element of the OCD, the O, the obsession, is the thought that enters our head that causes us anxiety. That anxiety can usually be relieved by performing some sort of behavior. In the examples that I've given, a checking behavior, or in the case of a fear of germs, the compulsion to wash your hands. And how many of us haven't had that happen when we touch something and we think, well, what have I just touched? Maybe I need to wash my hands. Now imagine those sorts of feelings and those compulsions magnified, maybe 100 times, 1,000 times, and pair that with the overwhelming feeling, even after we've performed the behavior, even after we've checked, that the moment we walk away, we need to check again. let's say a few seconds after we've washed our hands, we're not sure what we've touched in those few seconds since we've washed. So the obsession enters our head again. I have germs on my hands, which leads to the compulsion of I need to wash my hands, or the germs are going to take hold. Again, this is kind of a theme that we introduced early on in the first lecture video, that abnormality exists on a continuum with normality, that many of the elements that we see in psychological disorders are normal aspects of behavior taken to an extreme that often causes the individual distress, that often causes the individual to drop out of certain important aspects of life. In essence, it causes them dysfunction. Two of the two Ds that we talked about earlier, distress and dysfunction. Also, in the case of some elements of obsessive-compulsive disorder, it might be dangerous. To wash your hands repeatedly, you're actually damaging the skin, actually defeating the purpose of washing, because many people that wash excessively have very dry, cracked skin that starts bleeding and makes it more likely that germs are going to enter into the body. So again, that's kind of the normal basis for an abnormal behavior or an abnormal element of psychology, a psychopathology, or the psychopathology of obsessive-compulsive disorder. Now, within the grouping of obsessive-compulsive disorders in the DSM-5, there's also been introduced now hoarding disorder. If you've ever watched the show Hoarding Buried Alive on the Discovery Channel, or Hoarders on A&E, you know basically what this sort of disorder entails. The person accumulates specific objects and they can't get rid of them. And you might think, well, how could this come to be? Well, again, I want you to perform a little thought experiment. How many of you have ever gone through your belongings and come across something, an item of clothing, a book, a piece of jewelry, it could be anything, and you're almost going to throw it out because you say to yourself logically, I haven't worn this piece of clothing in 4 years. I haven't read this book in 10 years. I haven't used whatever item it could be in 5 or 6 years. But the thought enters your head, what if I throw it out and at some point I need it? What if I throw it out and at some point someone else needs it? Or perhaps you look at the book and you remember that this book was given to you by someone who's deceased, and you feel like if you were to give it away, something bad would happen. And in that perhaps sentimental sort of superstition, you think, well, it's best just to play it safe and to keep this object. I think we've all done that from time to time. Now again, magnify that 100 times, 1,000 times, and you could possibly start to see the behavior that you have in hoarding, where the person can't get rid of anything. If you watch these shows, you see that the person, when trying to get rid of something, will say, yeah, but I could use this. There's a possibility that in the future I could use this. Or there's a possibility that someone else could use it. In fact, I've had it happen where I've given away books to students or donated books to libraries or sold them to half-price books, and then 6 months later, I'm looking for that book. And I think, oh my gosh, darn it, I sold it. Then the next time I go through books and think about throwing one away or selling it or giving it to someone, that thought enters my head. Ah, but I could perhaps use it later on. Maybe that same thing will happen, where there will come a need for it. And again, I want you to see some of the normality in the abnormal behavior, some of the possible adaptiveness in what can become maladaptive behavior. Again, emphasizing the point that abnormality can exist on a continuum, and that we all have certain elements of these behaviors. So hopefully that'll make us seem a little more sympathetic to individuals with these behaviors and understand perhaps a little bit of where they're coming from.